You are looking down at a grainy black and white photograph taken from the open cockpit of a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, sometime in the middle decades of the 20th century, cruising low over the wheat fields of central Ukraine, not far from a modest village called Talianki. In the print, faint but unmistakable once you know to look for them, are rings. Not one ring, but many, nested inside each other like ripples frozen the instant after a stone hits still water, dark lines of disturbed soil tracing out circles and ovals across hundreds of hectares of open farmland. For years, photographs like this one were filed away without much comment, curiosities of aerial surveying, the kind of soil anomaly that shows up over old riverbeds or forgotten field boundaries and rarely means very much. Nobody flying that plane, and for a long time nobody studying the photographs afterward, seriously entertained the idea that they were looking at the ground plan of a town. Photographs of that kind had actually existed for decades before anyone treated them as anything more than a curiosity. Aerial surveys over this stretch of Ukraine had been quietly accumulating in Soviet archives since at least the 1930s, and it was not until 1971 that the Ukrainian archaeologist Konstantin Shishkin, studying imagery over the fields around Talianki, made the connection nobody before him had been willing to commit to, that the concentric dark rings were not a trick of soil moisture or an old river channel, but the compacted, fire-altered remains of an enormous buried settlement, its houses. Arranged with obvious intention across an area that dwarfed anything a Soviet-era archaeologist expected to find from the deep prehistoric past. Even then, full confirmation took years of patient, unglamorous fieldwork, matching soil chemistry and small test excavations against the aerial anomalies one section at a time, before Talianki's true scale could be stated with any confidence at all. They were wrong, and the scale of exactly how wrong is still being worked out today. When archaeologists finally took the anomaly seriously enough to survey it properly, first with careful aerial interpretation and later with ground-penetrating magnetometers dragged in patient grids across the same wheat fields, the rings resolved into something almost nobody expected to find buried under an ordinary stretch of Ukrainian farmland. The ground plan of one of the largest settlements built anywhere on Earth before the first cities of Mesopotamia had fully taken shape. At its peak, the settlement now called Talianki covered something in the neighborhood of 450 hectares, arranged as concentric rings of houses radiating out from open central spaces, and archaeologists studying the site have offered population estimates running from several thousand people to, by some calculations, well over 10,000. Figures that would place it comfortably among the largest human settlements anywhere in the world at the time it was thriving. And the people who built it, so far as the evidence shows, had no king, no writing, and, as best anyone can tell, no walls. The culture responsible for Talianki and for dozens of settlements like it across a broad swath of what is now Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine goes by a slightly awkward hyphenated name in the archaeological literature, Cucuteni-Trypillia. The double name exists because the same culture was discovered independently, on two sides of a border that did not mean much to the people who actually lived there 5,000 or 6,000 years earlier. In Ukraine, the story begins in 1897, when the archaeologist Vychniki Voyka excavated distinctive painted pottery near a village called Trypillia, a short distance south of Kiev along the Dnipro River. Around roughly the same period, similar painted wares were being unearthed in the hills of northeastern Romania near a village called Cucuteni, initially studied as an apparently separate tradition. It took decades of comparison for archaeologists to recognize that Voyka's Trypillia finds and the Cucuteni material described further west were, in essence, regional expressions of the same enormous cultural network, one that at its broadest extent stretched across an area larger than many modern countries, and that endured, in one form or another, for something on the order of 1500 years. Cucuteni-Trypillia belongs to a wider constellation of Chalcolithic farming cultures that some archaeologists, following the influential work of the Lithuanian-American scholar Maria Gimbutas, have grouped loosely together under the label Old Europe, societies scattered across the Balkans, the lower Danube, and the Black Sea's western coast, working copper and, in places, gold, centuries before similar metalworking traditions appear in Western Europe. The Varna culture on the Bulgarian coast, famous for the extraordinary gold grave goods found in its cemetery, and the Cucuteni-Trypillia world further north and east were, broadly speaking, contemporaries within this same wider sphere, and Trypillia sites have themselves produced copper axes, awls, and ornaments, evidence of a functioning trade network reaching toward the copper-rich regions of the Balkans and the Carpathians even as most everyday tools remained, as they had for millennia before, flint, bone, and antler. To place that span in perspective, 1500 years is longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire from its founding legends to the fall of Constantinople, longer than the gap separating you, right now, from the early medieval kingdoms of post-Roman Europe. And for most of that immense stretch of time, this culture was raising some of the largest settlements the Neolithic and early Chalcolithic world had ever seen, using nothing more sophisticated than timber, clay, thatch, and an evidently very deliberate sense of how a community that size ought to be laid out. What makes Talianki, and sites like it, genuinely strange to archaeologists studying early urbanism is not simply the size. It is the absence of almost everything a scholar of ancient cities is trained to look for once a settlement gets that large. Walk the layout of Talianki as reconstructed from the magnetometry surveys, and you find a settlement organized with unmistakable intention, houses arranged in tight, roughly concentric bands following the contour of one or more great ovals, with wide radial gaps functioning like streets cutting between them, opening onto broad central spaces kept largely free of buildings. That is not an accident of gradual, unplanned growth, the kind of organic sprawl you would expect from a village that simply added houses wherever there happened to be room over the generations. It looks deliberate, almost civic, the product of some kind of shared understanding about where a house could and could not go. And yet, when archaeologists have gone looking for the things that usually explain this kind of coordinated large-scale planning, a palace, a temple complex, a residence conspicuously larger and richer than its neighbors, any physical marker of a ruling elite standing apart from everyone else, they have, again and again, largely come up empty. A typical house, reconstructed from excavated examples across the culture's territory, was a substantial timber-framed structure with walls of woven wattle packed and plastered with clay daub, some evidently rising to a second story, its interior floor and often its walls finished with the same reddish-orange painted plaster and swept-clean hearths that show up, generation after generation, in site after site. Ovens for baking bread, grinding stones for processing cereal grain, loom weights for weaving cloth, and storage bins for grain and dried goods appear reliably across excavated houses, painting a picture of settled, agriculturally secure households raising cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs alongside fields of wheat, barley, and peas, a comfortable, technologically unremarkable Neolithic farming economy that happened, for reasons still not entirely understood, to scale itself up into settlements of a size almost nothing else on the continent matched for another 2,000 years. The houses themselves, where excavated, tend to be broadly similar in size and construction to one another, some evidently large enough to have housed extended, multi-generational families, a handful somewhat larger still and tentatively interpreted by some researchers as possible communal assembly buildings rather than private homes. But nothing in the archaeological record so far points decisively to a hereditary chief, a priest-king, or any comparable figure of concentrated personal authority presiding over a town of, by some estimates, 10,000 people or more. This runs directly against one of the more comfortable assumptions in the study of early complex societies, that once a settlement crosses a certain population threshold, some form of centralized hierarchy becomes practically unavoidable, simply as a matter of logistics, in order to coordinate food storage, resolve disputes, and organize labor. The megasites of the Cucuteni-Trypillia world are one of the most cited challenges to that assumption anywhere in world archaeology, a genuine, still unresolved puzzle. How, exactly, do you keep a town this size functioning, generation after generation, apparently without anyone formally in charge of it? Archaeologists studying this puzzle have increasingly reached for a different vocabulary than the traditional language of chiefdoms and kingdoms, borrowing a term some anthropologists call heterarchy, to describe a society organized through multiple overlapping, situational forms of authority, a respected elder here, a skilled craftsperson there, perhaps a rotating council drawn from different neighborhoods or kin groups, rather than a single fixed hierarchy with one person or one family permanently at its apex. It is a pattern that shows up, in different forms, in other large early settlements this channel has explored before, including the sprawling cities of the Indus Valley, whose excavators have likewise struggled to identify an obvious royal palace or a ruler's tomb despite a population living at genuine urban scale. Cucuteni-Trypillia's megasites may simply represent an unusually well-preserved, unusually early example of a broader and still poorly understood category, large, coordinated human communities that organized themselves successfully for generations without settling into the kind of centralized rule so many later, better documented civilizations eventually did. Whatever kept the megasites functioning, it did not keep them permanent. And this is where the story of Cucuteni-Trypillia takes its strangest turn, because the culture that built these enormous, apparently peaceable, apparently leaderless towns also had a habit that looks, on the surface, almost self-destructive. They burned their own houses down. Not occasionally, not as the result of some catastrophic accident or a single recorded disaster, but as an overwhelmingly consistent pattern repeated across hundreds of excavated structures throughout the culture's entire 1500-year run. Archaeologists have a specific term for the resulting archaeological feature, borrowed from the Ukrainian and Russian word for platform, plashchadki, hardened, fire-reddened clay platforms that are all that survive of a house's daub and timber floor once flame has swept through it and baked the clay nearly to the consistency of pottery, preserving, in remarkable and almost eerie detail, the layout of ovens, storage bins, and household goods exactly as they stood the moment the fire took hold. The debate among archaeologists is not really about whether these fires were deliberate. The physical evidence for that is, at this point, fairly persuasive. The burn patterns are frequently even and thorough in a way accidental house fires rarely are, and in a number of excavated examples researchers have found evidence consistent with extra fuel deliberately packed beneath floors and around support posts. The kind of preparation you would expect from someone setting a controlled fire rather than someone fleeing from an uncontrolled one. The real debate is about why. Why would a community, evidently one capable of remarkable long-term planning, coordinated construction, and apparently peaceful large-scale cohabitation, routinely burn down the very houses its own people had built and lived in, and in many cases, why would they do it not just to individual structures but, at a broader cyclical scale that some researchers estimate at roughly every 60 to 80 years? To entire settlements at once, abandoning some sites permanently in the process and elsewhere, apparently rebuilding nearby, almost as if beginning again. Several explanations circulate in the scholarly literature, none of them fully proven, and it is worth sitting with all of them rather than picking a favorite, because the honest answer is that nobody currently knows which, if any, is correct. One line of thinking treats the burning as fundamentally ritual, a kind of symbolic death performed on the house itself, perhaps tied to the death of its senior occupant, or to the closing of a generational cycle. The structure ceremonially destroyed the way a body might be, its ashes and hardened clay platform left as a kind of monument or grave marker in the landscape rather than simply cleared away. A second and quite differently framed hypothesis, associated in particular with the archaeologists John Chapman and Biserka Gdańska, proposes something closer to a deliberate social mechanism. That periodically destroying a household's accumulated possessions and the physical structure representing its wealth may have functioned as a built-in check against exactly the kind of hereditary inequality that tends to calcify into hierarchy over generations elsewhere in the world, burning the house, in effect, as a way of resetting the social ledger before any one family's advantage could compound into something resembling permanent rank or rule. A third, more practical school of thought points to the sheer ecological footprint of these enormous settlements, whose timber-hungry construction and surrounding fields and pastures would have exhausted local woodland and soil fertility within a few generations, making periodic burning and relocation less a ritual choice than a pragmatic, if smoke-filled, form of land management. None of these explanations rules the others out entirely, and it is entirely possible, even likely, that different communities across a 1500-year span and a territory the size of a small country burned their houses down for more than one of these reasons at once. Before we go further into what these communities actually made and believed, and into the equally puzzling question of what they did with their dead, this is a good moment to hit subscribe if you want more evenings spent with stories like this one, Vanished Settlements, Unresolved Archaeological Mysteries, and the slow, careful work of piecing together civilizations the wider world mostly forgot, with new episodes going up regularly for exactly this kind of listening. Whatever their reasons for burning their homes, the people of Cucuteni-Trypillia left behind an artistic tradition strikingly out of proportion to how little most people outside Eastern Europe have heard of them. Their painted pottery, produced entirely by hand without the aid of a potter's wheel, ranks among the most sophisticated ceramic art anywhere in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic world. Large storage vessels and finely made bowls covered in flowing, deliberately composed bands of spirals, meanders, and wave-like curves, executed in confident red, black, and white slip against a burnished background, the kind of controlled, rhythmic design work that takes real specialization to produce consistently. Across an enormous cultural territory and a very long span of time. Archaeologists studying the pottery's distribution have used shifts in its painted style almost the way a geologist reads rock strata, tracking gradual regional changes in motif and technique as a rough chronological and geographic map of the culture's development, generation by generation, workshop by workshop, across a territory that eventually spanned parts of 3 modern countries. Alongside the pottery, and just as characteristic of the culture, are the figurines, small, stylized human forms, the overwhelming majority of them female, modeled in fired clay and recovered by the thousands from house floors and pits across virtually every excavated Cucuteni-Trypillia settlement. Earlier generations of archaeologists, working in a mid-20th century intellectual climate fascinated by the idea of a widespread prehistoric mother-goddess religion, tended to label these figures simply as goddesses and left it more or less at that. More recent scholarship treats that reading with considerably more caution, since the figurines vary enormously in posture, decoration, and apparent context from house to house and site to site, suggesting a use, or uses, considerably more varied and locally specific than a single unified religious cult, household protective charms, ancestor representations, fertility or agricultural symbols, teaching or storytelling objects, or some combination that shifted meaning across the culture's long lifespan. What can be said with more confidence is that these small clay figures mattered enough, to enough different households, over enough centuries, to be made and kept and eventually broken or buried in extraordinary numbers, leaving behind one of the richest bodies of prehistoric figurative art anywhere in Europe, produced by a culture whose actual beliefs about them we can only reconstruct at a considerable and frustrating remove. The spiral itself, endlessly repeated across painted vessels from one end of the culture's territory to the other, has invited a long list of interpretations from researchers trying to read cosmology out of pure decorative pattern, always a risky exercise at this remove in time. Some have proposed the motif traces the coiling movement of a serpent, an animal with deep symbolic resonance in many later Eurasian farming cultures. Others read it as an abstracted representation of flowing water or of the sun's perceived cyclical movement across the sky, fitting neatly with a farming society whose entire livelihood depended on predictable seasonal rhythm. None of these readings can be confirmed against any surviving text, because this culture, like the overwhelming majority of the prehistoric world, left no writing behind at all, only the pattern itself, painted with obvious care and consistency across 15 centuries and hundreds of kilometers, a visual language whose grammar we can describe in detail without ever being entirely sure what it was actually saying. And then there is the puzzle of the missing dead. For a culture that built some of the largest settlements in the prehistoric world and sustained itself for a millennium and a half, the number of formal cemeteries securely associated with the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasites is startlingly small, nowhere close to what population estimates in the thousands, generation after generation, would seem to demand. A handful of burial grounds are known from the broader cultural sphere, generally smaller and earlier in date than the Great Megasite phase, which only sharpens the question rather than answering it. Where, over some 1,500 years and untold tens of thousands of individual lives, did the people of Talianki, Maidanetske, and the other great megasites actually bury, or otherwise dispose of, their dead? Proposed answers range from funerary practices that would leave little or no durable archaeological trace, such as exposure of the body or cremation followed by scattering rather than burial, to the possibility that burial grounds associated with the largest sites simply have not yet been located, buried under centuries of subsequent farming in a landscape that is, after all, still being actively cultivated today. Whatever the explanation, it remains one of the genuinely open questions hanging over this culture, and it is a strange kind of absence, a civilization we can trace in remarkable, room-by-room architectural detail through its burned house floors, and yet one whose relationship with its own dead has left almost no trace at all. Uncovering that architectural detail without disturbing a single artifact in the ground is, in itself, one of the more remarkable stories in how this culture came to be understood at the scale it is understood today. Excavating a site the size of Talianki in the traditional sense, trench by careful trench, would take archaeologists many, many lifetimes and would in any case destroy far more of the fragile, fire-hardened evidence than it preserved. Instead, beginning in earnest in the years around 2009 through the early 2010s, an international team working under what became known as the Trypillia Megasites Project, including researchers such as John Chapman, Biserka Gadarska, and longtime Ukrainian specialists in the culture including Mikhailo Vidyko, dragged magnetometers in careful, exhaustive grids across hundreds of hectares of open farmland at sites including Nebelivka, Maidanetske, and Talianki itself, measuring tiny variations in the magnetic properties of buried, fire-altered clay to build up a complete, non-invasive map of an entire prehistoric town's footprint, every house, every gap functioning as a street, every open plaza, without lifting more than a token amount of soil. The resulting maps are, frankly, startling to look at. Laid out on a page, the magnetometry survey of a site like Nebelivka resolves into something that looks less like a scatter of prehistoric huts and unmistakably more like the deliberate plan of a town, concentric ring after concentric ring of houses, radial streets slicing through them at regular intervals, and, at Nebelivka in particular, an unusually large structure near the settlement center that its excavators have proposed, cautiously, may have functioned as some kind of assembly building, a shared civic space serving a population that had, by any reasonable measure, outgrown the scale at which purely informal, face-to-face community decision-making usually remains workable. It is a discovery that has quietly pushed its way into much broader conversations among archaeologists about what actually counts as a city, and about whether the traditional checklist long used to define early urbanism, writing, monumental religious architecture, a visible ruling class, defensive walls, was ever really the only path a genuinely large, coordinated, thriving human settlement could take. A high-precision radiocarbon dating study of Maidanetske published in 2016 added a genuinely surprising wrinkle to how researchers now think about the megasite's populations. Rather than confirming a single settlement steadily and continuously packed with 10,000 permanent residents for generations on end, the tightly resolved date suggested that occupation within different neighborhoods of Maidanetske may have shifted and rotated over time, some quarters newly built and inhabited while others already stood empty or had recently burned, which would mean the astonishing full-scale population estimates for these towns may represent a maximum reached only briefly, or a total that circulated through different sections of an enormous settlement in overlapping waves rather than one filled edge to edge, all at once, for the entirety of its centuries-long history. It is the kind of finding that makes an already strange settlement pattern stranger still, adding a further layer of uncertainty to almost the only thing about these towns that had seemed relatively settled: how many people, at any given moment, were actually living there. For all that sophistication, the megasite phase of Cucuteni-Trypillia did not last forever, and its ending is, like so much else about this culture, more of an extended fade than a single dramatic collapse anyone can point to with real confidence. Sometime around 3000 BCE, give or take a few centuries depending on the site and the dating method used, the very largest settlements stopped being built and occupied at their previous scale, and the broader cultural tradition that had painted pottery in those distinctive spirals and burned its houses in that distinctive cyclical pattern begins, over the following few centuries, to fragment into smaller, more dispersed communities, before finally fading out of the archaeological record entirely by around 2750 BCE. Several broad explanations have been proposed for that long unwinding, and, true to form for this culture, none of them commands anything close to full consensus. Climate is one persistent candidate. This general period across a wide stretch of Eurasia coincides with a broader, if unevenly documented, cooling and aridification trend sometimes discussed under the label of the 5.2 kilo-year event, and a shift toward a drier, less predictable growing season would have placed real strain on agricultural communities that had already been supporting settlements of unprecedented size for centuries. A second candidate is more purely ecological and, in a way, almost built into the culture's own habits. After a millennium and a half of building enormous timber-framed towns and periodically burning them down only to rebuild nearby, the cumulative pressure on local woodland and soil fertility across the entire region may simply have caught up with a way of life that had, for a very long time, been able to outrun its own consumption by moving on to fresh ground. A third factor increasingly discussed in the literature involves the broader movement of steppe pastoralist populations, genetically and culturally related to the groups archaeologists associate with the later Yamnaya cultural horizon, westward across the Pontic steppe during roughly this same window of time, bringing new patterns of mobility, herding, and, eventually, New genetic and cultural influences into the wider region. Ancient DNA studies published over the past decade have added real texture to that steppe migration side of the story, even if they have not settled it. Genetic sampling from burials across the wider Pontic-Caspian steppe region shows a substantial demographic shift beginning in roughly this same broad window, as populations carrying ancestry associated with steppe pastoralist groups expanded outward into much of the rest of Europe over the following centuries, eventually contributing significantly to the genetic makeup of populations living across the continent today. Whether that expansion reached the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasites directly and displaced or absorbed their population, brushed past their eastern edges without much direct contact, or arrived only after the megasites had already been abandoned for entirely unrelated reasons, is still argued over by specialists working with a frustratingly thin scatter of directly relevant burials from the megasite zone itself. Most of the wider steppe evidence coming from areas east and south of the core Trypillia settlement region rather than from the megasites in question. What is notably absent from that list, at least so far, is clear archaeological evidence of violent conquest specifically targeting the megasites themselves. Unlike some of the collapses this channel has covered elsewhere, there is no widespread layer of unambiguous battle destruction, no significant concentration of weapon-related skeletal trauma, associated with the end of the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasite phase. The ending, so far as the current evidence allows anyone to say, looks less like a conquest and more like an extended, uneven dispersal, fewer new megasites founded, existing ones gradually shrinking or being abandoned and, this time, simply not rebuilt at the same enormous scale nearby, the great cyclical pattern of burning and renewal that had sustained these towns for well over a millennium finally, quietly, failing to repeat itself one final time. It is worth pausing on how unusual that combination of circumstances actually is, before we let the story close. Almost everywhere else in the world where archaeologists find evidence of very large, very early settlements failing, there is some obvious villain to point to in the wreckage, a fortification wall breached and burned, a mass grave bearing the marks of battle, a foreign inscription boasting of conquest, a written record from a rival power describing exactly what happened and when. Cucuteni-Trypillia offers none of that. Its megasites simply stop appearing, one by one, over roughly 2 or 3 centuries, without a single clear moment anyone can point to and call the end. That absence of a dramatic final chapter is not a gap in the archaeology so much as it may be the genuine shape of what happened, not a sudden fall, but the slow, uneven exhaustion of a way of living at that particular scale, a pattern of renewal through fire that had worked, more or less, for 1500 years, simply failing at last to renew itself one more time. What is left, today, is mostly what started this story, rings in the soil, visible from the air if you know where and how to look, across stretches of Ukrainian and Moldovan and Romanian farmland that have been plowed and planted, season after season, for generations without most of the people working that land having any idea what lay beneath it. Somewhere under those wheat fields are the compressed, fire-hardened floors of houses whose builders organized a settlement of 10,000 people or more without, so far as anyone can tell, a king to command them, and who then, with what looks like real deliberation, burned those same houses down again and again across 1500 years, for reasons that remain genuinely, honestly unresolved. We do not know for certain whether that burning was a ritual, a social safety valve, a practical land management habit, or some shifting combination of all three across different generations and different communities. We do not know, with any real confidence, where this culture buried its dead, if indeed burial is even the right word for whatever it actually did with them. And we do not know exactly which of climate, exhausted land, or newly arriving neighbors finally tipped a 1500-year-old pattern of renewal into a fade that, this last time, never circled back around. The rings are still there, waiting for the next careful survey, the next magnetometer dragged patiently across another quiet field, to see what else they are still willing to give up.